Hello, and welcome to the University of Chicago Institute of Politics' latest speaker series event, Anti-Trans Politics, How We Got Here and Where We Are Going. Thank you to the Office of LGBTQ+ Student Life at the Center for Identity and Inclusion for co-sponsoring this event. My name is Jen Spinolio, and I'm a third year in the college studying data science and economics, as well as a board member of Spectrum, the IOP's LGBTQ+ student civic engagement group. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Chase Strangio is the Deputy Director for Transgender Justice with the American Civil Liberty Union's LGBT and HIV Project, and an activist for transgender rights. Chase was counsel in many of the most important legal fights for LGBTQ+ rights of the past decade, including victories against North Carolina's infamous HB 2, President Trump's ban on trans armed service members, and guaranteeing same-sex marriage rights and that queer people cannot be fired for their sexuality or gender identity. In 2020, he was named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time. Chase is currently serving as a visiting IOP Pritzker Fellow. Jennifer Williams is a city councilwoman in Trenton, New Jersey, and the first openly transgender person elected to office in New Jersey. Councilwoman Williams is also currently the chair of the Trenton Republican Committee. She is also a writer, healthcare professional, small business owner, youth sports coach, parent, and an avid Philadelphia Eagles fan. Andrew Flores is an assistant professor of government at the American University School of Public Affairs and an affiliated scholar at the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Law, a research center focusing on LGBTQ+ law and policy. His research focuses on public attitudes and policy towards queer people. His work has appeared in a number of peer-reviewed journals. Hannah Rosen is a reporter and author whose work has appeared in New York Magazine, The Washington Post, The New Yorker, and she is currently the host of Radio Atlantic and a senior editor at The Atlantic. She has written extensively about the experiences of trans youth. Before we begin, please silence or turn off your cell phones. When it is time for Q&A, a microphone will be placed in the audience. Please line up behind the microphone. Priority will be given to UChicago students per IOP policy. Some upcoming speaker events before we begin. Please join us on November 13th at 12:30 p.m. in the IOP House for Cassidy Hutchinson, Her Time in the White House and Its Cost, as we welcome the former aide to Mark Meadows and President Trump in discussion with Pritzker Fellow Representative Stephanie Murphy. Also on November 3rd, the IOP and the student-run International Policy Program will be hosting journalists Shabani Matani and Timothy McLaughlin for their seminar, Among the Braves, a narrative history of Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement at 11 a.m. in the IOP House. And now, please give a warm welcome to our guests, Chase Strangio, Jennifer Williams, Andrew Flores, and Hannah Rosen.
Thank you all for coming. We'll start with a very important question, which is, Jennifer, what sports team do you coach? That did not come up.
Basketball and soccer.
And
used to do t-ball.
Amazing. Well, the place we're going to start from here is, one thing we know for sure is that just a few years ago, trans rights was not really a part of the public political conversation. It would have been unusual if it came up in a political campaign, and there wasn't much legislation about it. And in just like lightning speed, it feels like, although I'm sure that is not true for people of watching it closely, but for those watching from the outside, all of a sudden it became the central cultural debate of our time. With literally hundreds of bills proposed across the nation, lots of legislation, in the majority of states. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to color in this landscape, like what actually is going on right now from these people who are watching it very, very closely. How did we get here, and what are the strategies to come out? So that's the arc of the conversation. I want to start by asking something that each of you has seen in the last few years on trans issues that is brand new and you hadn't encountered before, just to give these guys a flavor of what you're seeing on the ground. So Jennifer, I'll start with you. Like, you're down in New Jersey, you're dealing with school politics, like local politics. How did this come up for you in the last few years?
Parental notification has been the scariest thing that we've been encountered. It's a part of every single school board race. It's a part of every legislative race. Today, the entire New Jersey legislature is up for election. And every single race that a Republican is in, they're trying to use this as a way to scare their base to come out and also try to influence moderate parents and independent parents and even some who are soft Democrats to vote their way. And they're even using third grade language such as our schools and our government shouldn't keep secrets from parents.
Can you say what parental notification is? And by the way,
Sure.
if any of you want to jump in with each other, I'm not God here. You can. I mean, I'm going to guide the conversation, but if you want to contribute, what is and where did it come? What is parental notification?
So parental notification is actually when a child starts identifying as being transgender, gender non-binary, or even shares with a counselor or a teacher that they're gay, that the school would be required to notify the child's parents, which has never been a legal question. It's never been a question that I've had to deal with as an advocate. It wasn't on our radar. Somehow in the last about 18 months, somebody probably with there's some very scary legal groups, Alliance Defending Freedom and Liberty Council, some policy groups, maybe Heritage Foundation, put this together as a simplistic way, post-COVID, post-vaccine issues, like with anti-vaxxers, to scare parents into voting against Democrats, saying that the schools are trying to take away your kid and the school's trying to control your kid.
Before we move on, why is that important? Like, why does it matter? Why is parental notification important for people who aren't? Like, what is it if you're a trans kid, just to play it out? Well,
right off the bat, 40% of homeless youth in this country are LGBTQ. And I don't think I'd have to really push anybody to think that most of that's because of a child being thrown out of their house for telling their parents, I'm gay, I'm trans, I'm gender non-binary. And one of the things I think a lot of these politicians, like a lot of politicians do, they grab onto the easiest thing that's able to be explained to the largest amount of people without thinking of the greater ramifications of that. And that's what we're combating now. But the problem with this particular issue is it scared a lot of our Democrat stalwart legislators, our elected leaders, from even defending their own bills they wrote a couple years ago to protect the LGBTQ community. Because it has the word parents, children, parents' rights. It's like has these hot button words. We'll come back to that. Chase, I mean, I don't even know where to begin with this question because the number of things that you've seen are probably amazing, but maybe we can talk about patterns. Like, you're tracking the legislation around the country. What patterns did you start to see in a bunch of different states? Templates, maybe.
So first, everything is a template. And I think it's important to situate this as these are not sort of homegrown, so to speak, policies, that they're crafted as model pieces of legislation that are being drafted by centralized groups or campaigns and then sent out to state legislatures. And so everything is a template in nature, and it's really building off of lots of movements that have tried to use fear to restrict bodily autonomy, to expand control in any number of ways. And so the trends really are ones you could trace back to, the formation of the United States, in which you can see that control over other people's bodies is a centerpiece of our constitutional structures. And we've seen iterations of that throughout our political and legal history. I sort of want to make two quick points, which is first on the issue of parental notification. One of the things that feels really hard in how we've had this particular conversation is we've sort of seeded this idea that the child and the parent are always adverse, and rather than situate, like as a parent, I actually really do want my child to have adults at school that they can talk to and not fear that is then going to be sent back to me. And if you think about queer young people, that having sites of exploration is so critical to survival, even if you do have supportive parents. And I think there are lots of ways that I would not I might not understand or create every possible conversation for me and my child, but school is a place where you hope to have those conversations. So everything becomes adversarial when in fact we're limiting the types of systems that we're creating for our young people, the types of opportunities to have trusted relationships, and that has so many consequences across, political and social and cultural life. The other thing then to say about the last few years is there is this very rapid escalation. And so even if we think about the anti-trans bills focusing on restrictions on access to medical care, and the trend around these restrictions, the actual categorical bans on treatment for minors did not emerge until 2020.
Can you just say what they are? Because I don't know that everybody knows what you mean by access to medical care, just so people fully understand what these bills are doing.
Yeah, so these are bills, and they have different sort of enforcement and penalty schemes, but in one way or another are either criminalizing or creating civil liability penalties for all gender-affirming medical treatment for trans adolescents, to be clear, because lots of cis adolescents also get gender-affirming medical treatment, and that is permitted, but it's prohibited, and in many places through criminal penalty for trans adolescents. So things like access to pubertal suppression, gender-affirming hormone therapy, and the few number of surgeries that older trans adolescents get as minors. All of them, because of the actually highly restrictive way this care is administered, are only through the context of parental consent.
And they penalize doctors.
And they penalize doctors, and in some cases have incredibly broad and unclear enforcement schemes that they could penalize parents, that penalize doctors not just for providing the care, but in many contexts for referring for the care. But the very first one of these bills emerged in 2020, at least one that got a hearing, and that was introduced in South Dakota. It was ultimately, it passed one chamber, it did not pass another, and at the time I thought, okay, well, we've seen an escalation, but this is a bridge too far. And even in 2021, one bill passed. It was vetoed by Republican Governor Asa Hutchinson in Arkansas, and then you now have 21 states that have passed.
Yes, that's what it happened so fast.
And 18 of those were passed in 2023. So just to think of that categorical shift, when you're talking about the last 4 years, 4 years ago, we didn't see any of these bills, let alone passage of these laws.
And just to take it out of the kind of legislation bills passed, I want everyone to understand what is actually happening. So you are a trans youth, you can be in the middle of your treatment, you can be in the middle of exploration of treatment. Even the mention of these bills, as a reporter I've seen this, is terrifying to the doctors because they're sort of felonies and legal penalties. So essentially the clinics, children's hospitals, they just shut down very quickly. So you're in a really difficult position because you're in the middle of a medical treatment, and you what do? You stop, you move. I've seen families do all of these different things, but just so that everybody understands what this means when it is actually happening on the ground.
And the other thing is we see this in the context of access to abortion and access to gender-affirming care. Is there's a lot of rhetoric and uncertain legal ramifications of doctors who are treating patients out across state lines. And we know the next step in this conversation is the criminalization of movement to access care. We've seen it in Idaho in the trafficking law that was passed in the context of abortion, and we know that's coming here. But because of that, doctors at hospitals in Chicago, at Lurie Children's, at Boston Children's, are not seeing patients from other states, that because they're not sure if they can accept patients where their state law bans the treatment.
Yes, so the other sub-theme is the abortion template. It's like watching how that has played out, I think, has given people a certain playbook. Andrew, I know you're tracking kind of broad sociological trends. What new attitudes or what shift in attitudes have you seen either as a result of this legislation? I mean, I don't know how the cycle works. We'll get to that. But what have you seen first?
Yeah, well, so go back, 10 years, and you saw a remarkable change in social attitudes towards marriage equality, other types of attitudes towards lesbian and gay rights. And we also started to see kind of an uptick and upward trend in support for transgender rights. Mm-hmm. In the last 3 years, we've actually seen a lot of opinion retrenchment in terms of what the data are showing.
Retrenchment meaning back to what?
More anti-trans attitudes. A majority of people kind of more supportive of what some would colloquially call the bathroom bills, basically policies that would restrict what public accommodations, accesses, and protections trans and gender diverse people would have. And that's usually the public restrooms, locker rooms, and things like that. And so the public opinion landscape has completely shifted, and it's not shifted kind of uniformly across the states. It's also related to many of these policies, the states that are passing these policies, you're actually seeing the pool in public opinion shift even wider there.
Wait, just slow that down for a minute. So, because this is a really important question, is what you were saying, do they bubble up from below? Like, is there a sort of deep cultural rebound happening to gay rights or something like that? Is there some rebound, or is it happening the other way around, where there are these laws passing for a whole bunch of political structural reasons, which are then affecting attitudes?
Yeah, it's always the chicken and the egg, right, in terms of what's causing what, and there's going to be some dialogue between the two. But we have, or I have access to a wonderful set of panel data. I'm going to get a little nerdy. So that means we can follow the same people over time, right? And so we can see how their attitudes have kind of shifted and whether or not those attitude shifts occurred before or after certain policy changes and context changes. And we're seeing more of anti-trans law and policy. So, which is also a kind of an embodiment of elite influence, right? Because you're thinking about media discourse, the heightened salience around, trans rights, trans youth, and then how that feeds into policy getting passed, and then kind of people thinking, well, now that this has been legitimized, this kind of
what
position.
Is this? Like this position.
This position.
Now that a person in power can say these things and hold this position.
Right.
Then what? Like my deepest position? Like what's the...
You become much more psychologically amenable to a position that would be more, say, exclusive of trans rights. The opposite is also true. So like I said, about right before Obergefell passed, I had another great access to panel data, and we were able to see what happens when states pass marriage equality. And we actually saw the legitimacy argument in the other way, where people who were once really opposed or really kind of ambivalent to trans rights actually did shift, same-sex marriage and marriage equality and lesbian and gay rights, that they actually shifted more affirming. And so this kind of state policy does have this kind of affirmation of a position. And it can bring some people along who might be, say, middle of the road and allow them to kind of pick a side or take a more solid position on those issues.
It's so wild because it has just become this central issue, and it's not a large number of people. It's fewer people. Well, we don't know actually because the windows are only opening now, but it's amazing how central it's become in our political discourse. Jennifer, you mentioned something which I hadn't known before, which is the way it's working in New Jersey has interesting kind of racial, ethnic cross currents. Can you talk about that?
For sure. So one of the things that we saw, particularly a few years ago, the 21 gubernatorial election. So every 4 years, 21 to 25, New Jersey and Virginia are the only two states that have gubernatorial elections. So in 21, we saw as parental issues became more of a big thing with COVID, with getting the vaccine, they moved towards the LGBTQ curriculum, which was to simply teach parts of history throughout different disciplines in schools, that the Republican candidate for governor started reaching out to particular ethnic groups and particular religious groups. And one of the things that he did, whether his advisors poll tested this or not, he tried to reach out to South Asian moms, Latino moms, and then Hasidic Orthodox community in Lakewood, New Jersey, which is one of our largest cities in New Jersey now. And the reason he did that was to try to stir up a lot of fears among parents about going to school and being forced to learn these things, that your kids are being things that are almost anathema to your religion or to your heritage. And unfortunately, it was very effective, but the worst part of it was not what he did for that one election. It's the well that was opened for every other candidate to come in his wake and do the same thing and make trans issues and LGBTQ curriculum issues a bigger part of every single election, from dog catcher up to state senator. And that's what we're seeing right now. So what I'm very worried about is as we move along into 2025, that this is just simply going to get worse, because one of the things that comes from these state bills, as bad as they are, is the rhetoric that happens, the changing social attitudes, the safety of transgender LGBTQ people. I grew up during an era where gay bashing was a very, very, very terrible thing, and it frequently happened. A lot of it was unreported. I'm really getting kind of concerned that we're going to end up in those days, but the way these progression of bills could go, 20 years down the road, could we end up with a governor that will stand in the doorway of a school and say that you're not allowed to come into the school because you're trans or non-binary or gay or lesbian? And that's where, when the school board issue happens in New Jersey, I think that's got to be a major flag for the rest of the country, particularly folks in the middle, folks on the left, because the Democrat Party, folks on the left, have been the drivers of LGBTQ rights, hands down. There's no question about it. But when we're having these bills happen and you have suburban moms, very liberal areas, even outside the Philadelphia area, which is something to talk about a lot on Morning Joe, that's when I think we really need, as a LGBTQ community, as people who are engaged in politics, need to start questioning both parties, but we need to ask them the same question. What are you going to do to make lives harder for LGBTQ people? Because it's one thing to say we're equal. And if you say you go for equality, that scares the heck out of conservatives and Republicans. So one of the things I've learned over time is talk to them about liberty, talk to them about freedom. And then when you get that conversation, then you bring in the equality question. And it's very, very effective. You have to bring them back to what they believe about America. And when we're not doing it, they can then say, well, in school boards and school systems, we shouldn't teach about DEI. We shouldn't teach about African American history. We shouldn't teach about LGBTQ history because they don't see it as the same as the America they were brought up in. And it's all about change.
We'll get there, because Jennifer is a Republican, has a lot of inroads into Republicans, so I feel like you can help us out on the
Thank you. I didn't want to go on a
see
thesis. I
things that other
appreciate it.
people don't see. So we'll get there. But I want to go back to what you saw on the other side. So this is definitely a leap, but I'm just going to try it out on you guys to see if you have seen it. It's particularly going to be a leap for someone who analyzes actual data. So you told me that about sort of reaching out to different immigrant communities. Then I remembered the New York Times poll that was in the New York Times poll this week, which was Trump making inroads into non-white communities. And I sort of put those two disparate data points together, and I did wonder if this thing that you've seen in New Jersey, you guys have seen anywhere else. Just a kind of the trans issue for some reason kind of lighting up immigrant communities to turn against Democrats.
Well, I can say from the data perspective that New York Times data poll is of course one among a constellation of polls, so we should always put that into context. But at the same time, the Gallup organization, as well as the Public Religion Research Institute, have put out polls recently that have shown a similar kind of decline in broad general support for social issues or progressive social issues.
Across all ethnic?
Nationally. I haven't looked at the subgroup analyses yet, but it's kind of constant. But one thing that is kind of thinking about like the Democratic Party and who tends to be coalitions of the Democratic Party, racial ethnic minority groups have various opinions already when it comes to progressive social policy, especially around LGBT rights. And it's not necessarily always that there's a majority in support of particular issues and particular topics, right? And so you have to think about the Democratic coalition as one that does have a diversity of viewpoint from all these diverse people, right? And so it means that you've still got to find a way to kind of communicate to those who may be closer allies or part of your coalition to convince them that they should be supportive of these issues as well.
But that's difficult. Like, it's difficult to do in a moment when you see sort of trans rights being eroded, and it's hard to be generous in that way, honestly. Like, it's just, I imagine it's hard. I'm not at the front lines of this. But.
Yeah, well, and historically, the LGBTQ rights movement had harder times crafting their message and why certain communities should be a part of their coalition. The marriage equality movement, Freedom to Marry, started a whole group called Familia es Familia. And it was this Latinx targeted or messaging strategy to kind of figure out how do we reach Latinx communities and actually talk to them about why marriage matters, but from the value points that they think are much more important to Latinx people. And so it's saying, look, there are people that could be, say, on our side, they just haven't been given a reason to be a part of that side yet. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just going back, sort of connecting this part of the conversation to sort of your point about, well, you have this, as far as we know, relatively small group of people who's igniting this widespread set of cultural and political anxieties and attacks. But if you look globally at the rise, and I sort of, I'm not an expert in global political structures and movements, but the rise of far-right governments globally coincides with this discourse around anti-gender ideology. You see it in Bolsonaro in Brazil and Eastern Europe, and it's because I think that structurally, control over the general population starts often with this desire to control the family and individuals' bodily autonomy. And trans people pose a fundamental threat to that inherently, to this idea that you can defy expectations that want to be controlled, the centrality of the sex binary to many, many political structures, not just social and cultural ones. So yes, it's about attacking trans people, but it's also about controlling people's, familial structures, their bodies, and that is, that type of control, I think, is central to many far-right political projects, which is why we see this conversation coinciding over the last 10 years globally with these rise of what I would consider to be sort of different formulations of fascist governments around the world. And then on this question of when you look at that in the United States and the particular histories here, and how I think effectively both the left has allowed and the right has often fueled this pitting apart of communities that are natural allies and constituencies. And I think you see that in the context of, equality-based rights fights, but also autonomy ones, also ones grounded in notions of liberty. And that's why we see, this disastrous breakdown in coalition building in the reproductive rights context and the trans rights context. And I say rights in particular, because I think there's like justice orientation framings of both movements that are more allied. But when you turn towards the law, there is a natural division because there are these expectations. There's a sense of scarcity that comes with it, and so communities are pitted apart, and then politicians, I think, effectively leverage those anxieties in order to sort of have these inter-community attacks in the service of power and the status quo.
I'm pausing because I'm thinking I wish I had been on the ground. Are they inter-community attacks, or are you just sort of like rolling with the wave of fear and failing to, it feels like something slightly, I can't tell if it's manipulated from above or, and maybe it doesn't matter.
But it doesn't matter because at the end of the day, the anxiety is born of this idea that everyone is suffering, but we don't want, that anxiety, is leveraging, that sense of I have to take what's mine.
Right.
And institutions can reinforce this. Like a lot of lawmakers who are allies to the LGBTQ community basically will say, you get one piece of legislation that I'm going to really try and fight for, right? And that means you have to order who's going to get what, right? And what might be passable and winnable, which means that you might be marginalizing even members of your own coalition, your own group. And that has happened historically.
And I guess, Jennifer, that's what you're saying when you're saying the Democrats are just backing off.
100%.
Because it's become so, I don't know what the word is, but so like loaded or something, or so emotional that they don't want to fight for it. Like the constituency isn't rich enough, or there's no David Geffen, there's no, it's just not quite powerful enough for them to stick their neck out in that way.
No, we're less than 1% of the American population. We don't have the money. We do not have the resources. Unfortunately, ever since marriage, many, if not most, of lesbians and gays left to feel the battle, per se. And even though the trans community was always there up until the fight for marriage equality, when something happened in 2015 in Houston, when there was a non-discrimination ordinance called HERO, And that failed, unfortunately. Ever since then, we've been fighting this battle, different places of the country, folks on the extreme right changing their language, changing their techniques. They tried to start off with restrooms. And then when restrooms started failing, then that's when they realized, let me start going after kids. Let's get people worried about kids. And that's when they started with different things with schools, still with accommodations. Trump taking away the Obama guidance in February of 17, went after the military later. And then they kind of thought, I think, that they completed it. Mm-hmm. And then once we got on the other side of 2020, that's when everything else happened. Mm-hmm. So it's very, very methodical, what they've done. And as they test one thing in one state or one town, and if it works, they sure as heck move it to other places. That's why today's election is very important, as well as what happens next year.
Who's they in that sentence? Is it like Republican strategist? Is it like is it like who's they?
Well, there's not a big roster, but one thing was very interesting. I'll try to tell this quick. When I went to the 2016 Republican National Convention in Cleveland, and I went there as a Republican, see the pageantry, et cetera. I wasn't a delegate for anybody, but I also knew we needed to have a transgender advocate on the ground. To at least, I didn't even know mainly, I'll be frankly, what I was exactly doing, but I knew if I talked to enough people, I could start, presenting reasonable doubt and also kind of get an idea where they're thinking. And one of the things that came up was Salem Broadcasting, which is a very, very conservative radio network host, had an event. And at this event, I got to meet with a guy named Hugh Hewitt, who used to be on CNN. And we had a little discussion afterwards. And I just asked him, so what's next? What are the other things that are going to happen for the LGBTQ community? And he goes, there's something that you should know about. It's called the Johnson Amendment. And he goes, we have a list of things that we want to do. Now, I don't know who all the we in this room is, but there is a list of different things regarding LGBTQ rights and liberties and freedom that folks in that community, whether they're evangelical or there's politically cynical, etc., there are people making key decisions of what to do to go after the rights, freedoms, and liberties of transgender people, LGBTQ people across the board. But it's easier to go after us because we don't have the resource. Much as we have an amazing lawyer, we don't have 100,000 of this amazing lawyer able to do that fight, and we don't have a David Geffen.
Chase, what state has been like the most vexing or something to you? Like, what's a state that could give us all an example of the kind of thing that you deal with or have to think about?
I find all state legislatures very vexing. I'm like, what is this political system that we've come up with? And the idiosyncrasies of each of them I find very troubling. I will say one of the interesting things over the last 10 years has been sort of South Dakota as this testing ground of anti-trans legislation. And there's this one chiropractor legislator who has been fixated on it, and then the way that it's worked, and there is a sort of coalition of organizations, including Alliance Defending Freedom and Heritage and Liberty Council, and now Stephen Miller of the Trump administration anti-immigrant fame has started America First Legal and is very, very focused on anti-trans litigation. And so there's new formations all the time. But to have a state like South Dakota, where you have the capital in Pierre, which is in western South Dakota, hard to get to, and so much is happening there. They have a legislature that moves incredibly quickly. So their legislative session is from January to March, and so if they decide to move a bill, it will happen very quickly. And like many other states, obviously you have a supermajority, relatively far right Republican leadership in both chambers and usually a Republican governor, most of whom have been very publicly anti-trans in nature, but you have this one lawmaker who's connected to a certain cadre of doctors and other advocates who keeps introducing and pushing different forms of the legislation. And they had the first bathroom bill, they had the first sports bill. They actually had a sports bill they started their anti-trans sports bill in 2014 before we even saw the emergence of the anti-trans bathroom bills in 2016 following the hero fight in Houston. And they also were the first state to have the medical care ban. And so all of that is happening. They're the testing ground for this model legislation, which I think there's different reasons for that, but I do find it relatively vexing and somewhat random because it is, I mean, you could sort of point to the length of their legislation or their legislative session or Deutsche's fixation with it, but it has been sort of a...
Like, why South
Dakota?
Yeah.
And then, and Governor Dugard, who was prior to Noam, the governor of South Dakota, vetoed the anti-trans bathroom bill that passed in South Dakota in 2016, and that was a big political victory. He met with trans kids, and like Asa Hutchinson with the anti-trans medical care ban in 2021, he said, "Why are we doing this?" And that you can see us slide so far backwards. I mean, that would never happen. Now, we couldn't get anyone to veto anything in 2023, even people we knew were opposed.
Interesting. I guess it's just too politically exciting or something, or effective, or I don't know what the right terrible word is.
Well, it's definitely the party's priority. And so where you saw, it wasn't being pushed by the caucus to the same degree. It was very much number one legislative priority. And this is a combination of the media discourse too. You have Matt Walsh doing his quote unquote expose at Vanderbilt, what is a woman documentary, and then the lawsuit we have in Tennessee, the bill, which is the medical care ban, is SB 1. It's the first bill filed. A lot of these bills are bill number 1. So to think about, of all the things going on, these states, number one.
Yeah, that's number 1. It is. I find it unbelievable. It's so amazing and hard to understand.
It's easier to punch down at a marginalized group when they don't have a way to fight back.
Yeah. You mentioned the sports bill. Do you make any distinctions in your mind? To me, it seems like the sports bill has more ambiguity, or the issue has more ambiguity than other issues.
I don't, for me it doesn't. I mean, for a number of, I think that I do make distinctions in terms of number of people impacted and how. And so if you have a limited amount of resources, like at the end of the day, we're prioritizing our lawsuits over the healthcare bans than over the sports bans at this moment. But I think the sports conversation is a very, sort of important pivot in this moment, because I think there was this sense that there was ambiguity. It was exploited. This is where the explosion happens, is over the sports conversation.
What do you mean the explosion?
The explosion.
People feel the most.
No, the explosion of the bills, the progress, is because they start to make progress on sports, and it leads the way to what we see today. It's a direct line from suggesting that there are legitimate debates to be had over trans people's bodies and over trans people's ability to go to school and participate in school on equal terms as their peers, to the medical care bans, and the same people are having them. At the end of the day, I was an athlete in women's sports. I know exactly how little people care about women's sports. I know exactly how little these Republican legislatures care about women's sports. And so to me, it was a disingenuous conversation. It was a conversation also steeped in anti-Blackness globally and here in the United States about who is a woman, and what people understand a woman to be is a white cis woman, and that is who is being sort of held up in those conversations. And the explosion happens with, I think it's fueled by the center-left media, and a lawsuit that happens in Connecticut over Connecticut's inclusive policy that demonizes my two clients, two young Black girls who had, I would say, a middling amount of success in high school track and field, got 0 scholarship offers, were facing a world as Black trans women, and all of the discrimination attendant to it. They became the focus of this conversation. Both of them quit track, and every single one of the young the white cis girls that started that lawsuit, represented by Alliance Defending Freedom, went on to compete in Division I collegiate track, while my clients gave up the sport that they loved. And so I think that, and there's a long history of this, sex testing in sport. If you look at the history going back 100 years, it was to first police women out of sports altogether, then to police Black women, and particularly Black and brown women from the global South, out of international sport. And that is what this legacy is. Kentucky and West Virginia each had exactly one known trans girl competing in sports, both of whom were competing at the middle school level. And that is who was kicked out.
Yeah, no, I get how it works on the ground. I think for me as a reporter, one thing I find difficult about this and have not figured out a way out of is that, so I wrote a story about Texas trans bill. I tried to have a conversation with the legislator who wrote the Texas trans bill. He immediately brought up Europe, like what's going on in Sweden and how Sweden has rolled back its policies. Now, I suddenly felt myself, and it's similar with sports, to be in really dangerous, manipulatable territory. Like, I could open up a window as an intelligent person who's read a lot about Sweden and Europe and have a conversation that lasted, say, 15 minutes about what's going on in Europe. Just as I feel like I could have a conversation, you might fully disagree with me about what the difference is in the sports issues and other issues. But having that conversation feels absolutely dangerous because it just gets like fed into the machine of manipulation. Like, why does every local legislator in South Dakota and Texas and Tennessee now knows all about Sweden? Like, suddenly they love Sweden.
They know nothing about Sweden.
They know nothing
they know
about
to
Sweden.
say the word Sweden, yes.
So I've suddenly felt like I did not want to, I shut it down and I didn't run it because I felt like there was no way to talk about any of this, to have even a debate in which we wildly disagree. It would all get flattened into, Sweden is rolling back. Like, just no way to talk about any of the nuances or any of the actual things happening. I don't know what to do about that. Just don't do it now. Right? Like, you can't have a sort of regular discussion about this.
Well, I will say, from my vantage point, we do have data on people's own willingness to kind of find some kind of compromise, to think about the nuance on this topic, sports specifically, and vast majorities don't.
Don't what? They just won't think about the nuance.
No, there's, like we said, say if there was some kind of policy that would come up that would kind of try and do what Governor Cox tried to propose in his veto. Right, yeah. Mm-hmm. And he kind of said, we were talking with advocates on both sides, and we were trying to say, can we come to some kind of reasonable common ground, which would still marginalize and stigmatize trans athletes, but it would still kind of say some trans athletes can compete, mm-hmm. right? And so we said, what do you think about this kind of compromise? And people were just very much not for it. And this is among those that were.
They were not for the discussion, or they were not for the compromise?
They were not for the compromise. So they're not ready to think about the nuance. Yeah. So in terms of public opinion, that's kind of where people are standing.
I just don't know how to handle that as a journalist. Like, it's new territory for me, where you just can't, you basically just, like, the conversation is just over. I don't want to have it because it'll just get I'll see it pop up in a Republican legislature in Tennessee somewhere in a way that I didn't intend it, and I just, feels dangerous.
If I might, for everyone like that gentleman you met, there are 10 others you could have a conversation with that just happen to have an R next to their name, and you probably could change their minds a good bit and get them to go to that compromise.
Let's move to that part of the conversation. You have been in Republican circles. You have talked to Republicans about this. You are a very, very unusual person who has a foot deep in the Republican camp and has been a trans activist. That's a Venn diagram of, probably 5. So
it's just not a Rorschach test.
So what, and Andrew, I would say, has done research about narratives, like or somebody he knows has sent his poor researchers to knock on random people's doors and talk to them about trans narratives, and we'll get to that. But maybe just a real life example for you of something we might not ever see where you managed to eke out a space and talk to people.
The best quick story I could tell you is I'll go back to 2016, the Republican National Convention, and long story short, somehow by meeting the right person on a plane from Philadelphia to Cleveland, I get invited to an evangelical church service the day before the convention. Mike Huckabee's going to be playing the bass. I had to see this. So, true story. And during the event, the way they have, I'm a Roman Catholic, but they had 10 people give testimonies, including one gentleman. It turned out that he happened to be the former chair of the South Carolina Republican Committee. And went up to introduce himself, said how moving his testimony was. We started talking about Republican issues, destroying ISIS, the economy, taxation, Second Amendment. And I just threw in, hey, I just would like to let you know that your governor, Nikki Haley, she did something that was really great. And he said, what's that? I said, she told a bunch of the media at a press conference that she didn't think South Carolina needed to have a restroom bill because no one in the state's talking about it, so she wasn't going to try to push one forward. And he goes, you really think that's a great idea? I said, it sure is, because I'm transgender. And you could see the computer in his brain, like, this doesn't compute. I just had a great conversation with this woman. And he said, why do you think that? And I said, because if you're going to have a law, you should have a law against assault against everyone in a bathroom, not just go after transgender people, because people like me and my family have the most to worry about. He goes, what would you do? I said, make it a Class B felony, put imprisonment on it, guaranteed, and that way it'll never happen. He goes, darn, you're more law and order than I am. And I said, again, that's because I have to be. Now, I may not change that entire room, but I can guarantee you for the next 4 days in Cleveland, Ohio, and when he went back to the first barbecue in South Carolina, he had to tell people about this nice transgender woman he met that agreed with him on 80% of the issues, but was transgender. And that's how I think we start this. We have to start having conversations, and we have to be unafraid in doing so. And I realize that not everybody can do that, but that's where, like, I feel I'm called to. But anybody who has that possibility, like Harvey Milk said a long time ago, we have to come out as much as possible, because when we do, people are less likely to vote against us.
We're going to open to audience questions in a few minutes, so I'm just getting you guys to prepare and think about that. Can you also tell the story about the sanctuary and the safe cities? I thought that was an interesting subtle one. Yeah.
So this past year, the issue of transgender families with a child, parents, medical providers fleeing some of the states you both have talked about, that was really coming to a head earlier this year. So we found out that in New Jersey, the Democrats, who actually had some really good bills, particularly one state senator, Andrew Zwicker from LD 16, put forward bills that would protect transgender families in New Jersey and have anybody coming to New Jersey from another state be protected. Well, it wasn't going to be actually voted upon. They were going to hold on to the bill to after today's election. And this is back in January. And I said, there's no way that that's going to happen. I talked to some other like-minded activists, and we approached Andrew Zwicker, the senator, to ask Governor Murphy in New Jersey if he would write an executive order. So I sent a PDF of the Minnesota governor's executive order, which would have will protect transgender families, their kids, medical providers, anyone in New Jersey, as well as anyone fleeing another state, and specifically has part of it that they cannot be extradited or penalized from another state once they come to New Jersey. And that was very, very important, because I knew people who were actually looking for a state to move to. Governor Murphy got it done in roughly about 35 days, which from what I understand, getting an executive order by a governor, I mean, you would know you're a governor, it's unheard of. But that's because we were able to work across party aisles, across the political aisle, because I think it was a simple idea, which is we're trying to protect our fellow citizens.
But also the critical thing being, don't call it a sanctuary city.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Yeah, that
so the other part
out.
is I specifically told the senator to tell the governor's office, do not use the word sanctuary state. That drives the Republicans insane. Call it a safe haven state. And because they did in their press releases, they didn't get attacked for having an executive order protecting transgender kids and families. So language is a very important thing. Try to think about the audience that you're trying to appeal to, but also the audience you don't want to give them ammunition to come at you with. So try to use safe haven.
Use safe haven. I want to ask both of you this, even though we're out of time, but just quickly, like narratives. You've written about narratives.
Yeah.
How hopeful narratives means tell people stories about people?
Right.
Is that what it means?
Well, we talked about two things. One was a study that I wasn't a part of, but it was done in Florida, where people were knocking on doors, canvassers, advocates, and it was, let's have a 10 to 15 minute conversation about trans people and trans rights. And part of that conversation was just informing people. And then part of it was kind of hearing their own discomforts, affirming those discomforts, and kind of bringing them along. It wasn't necessarily clear that those conversations would always change someone's mind, but those researchers found that in the long term that they actually had lasting change from that. Some of my own work has kind of looked at how do the stories do we tell around transgender rights and how does that impact people? And because because of the smaller percentage of people who are trans, people may not know someone who is transgender, may not have a kind of grounding, and so without that kind of understanding, they're allowed to kind of get told what other people that this is such a scary thing, right? Or they get to make certain assumptions that once you hear these stories, you might be able to start questioning those assumptions and start being able to ground kind of your own understanding. And those storytelling moments are effective. We do see some change there.
I did think about the speed of things, whereas with gay marriage, it was kind of a slower buildup because it was started before social media, and then there were TV characters. It all just kind of happened more slowly, and then people had sort of familiar personal experiences and cultural experiences, whereas this was just people developed really strong opinions without any knowledge, like no cultural knowledge, no personal experience or anything. So then it's like you're in a position of having to roll things
Yeah,
back.
well, the stories are starting to be there, though. It's like there was the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, a trans character, kind of shows the harms that they face when they're in the locker room, right? And tries to flip the narrative around who is actually the predator in that scene, right? And then there's a great documentary called Changing the Game that is about trans young athletes and kind of the difficulties that they face as being trans athletes. And so there are stories, that there are fewer, but they're percolating.
Chase, very last thing, over the horizon, any optimism over the horizon?
I mean, so in the short term, or looking at sort of state legislation, no optimism. I think it's only going to get worse. There's lots of reasons for that, and we're moving into a presidential election year.
Worse, just like more.
I think more, and the substance will be scarier. I think, we're going to see expanded restrictions on healthcare, expanded parental notification, forced outing, and language matters. Everyone talks about it a different way. But so that I think that's going to get worse. And from my perspective, though, the reality that trans people have existed forever, that queer people have existed forever, that we continue to mobilize and care for each other, and we have all of the tools. And, there is this incredibly devastating material backlash and survival opportunities, but trans people have lived under and continue to live under incredibly restricted and violent circumstances. And so my optimism comes from the just sheer incredibleness of our communities and the fact that we know exactly where to care for each other and how. We know exactly how to get people healthcare when they need it. And one of the things that I said after Dobbs was if you want to know how to get extra legal ways to get each other healthcare, come talk to trans people, because we've been doing it forever. I mean, I'm only 41 years old, and nobody had access to healthcare through any legal, accessible, covered means when I was coming out. So we know how to get things done. We've been leading movements, not just the LGBTQ movement, but many movements always. And so that's where my optimism lies, and that's where my sense of possibility lies.
That's good. That's good. We can go with that. Anybody have questions for anyone on the panel? Come to the mic if you have questions.
Hello, my name is Oliver. I'm a first year in the college. I'm from Toledo, Ohio. I went to a really small high school with less than 250 students. And my senior year, we had to have a school assembly about the phone calls the school was getting from parents who were concerned that there were litter boxes in the school bathroom for children who identified as cats. And a couple months later, Republicans were campaigning. Heidi Gonal was running for governor of Colorado on that issue, which is obviously fake and comes sort of out of complete misinformation space. So my question is, how do you deal with people who have that level of disconnect with reality, and can you have a conversation with them as a trans person, as a queer person, when they are so far outside of the realm of what we would consider traditional political discourse, but that has overtaken political discourse?
I actually had that conversation with a Missouri legislator last year who started off by asking me a question about having his daughter, who plays tackle football, lose a scholarship to a transgender female athlete. And then when I dispelled that whole question, he moved to, well, what about this thing about having litter boxes in bathrooms? It's just something where it gets out on the internet, it becomes a meme. What I would suggest is just do what I did, which is stick with the conversation. Just, you say, sir, that's utterly ridiculous. There's no kids in America doing that. But while they have that hot moment, that was a meme for like about a month. And then the state senator, I think in Nebraska, who originally talked about it, admitted on the floor of the Nebraska legislature and said that he was misled, and he apologized for telling that story. But even if you have to deal with someone like that, still get your facts out, tell them what's really going on, try to provide a couple legitimate resources, because they may not facially show you that they're going to check that out, but if you do not talk to them, no one's going to talk to them. And please always remember, what you do is important for 100 people behind you minimally, because every time you talk to an elected official, they're going to tell everybody else in your circle that they had that conversation with you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, I'm Angie. Wait, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'm Angie. I'm a first year at the college. And yeah, my question is about, so like obviously most of the like bills that are being proposed and passed are like coming from Republicans and like far-right Republicans in state legislatures, and they like rightly get a lot of the blame for like what's happening. But then more on like the media narrative side of things, like a lot of the sources that have like sort of contributed a lot to the trans debate and like sort of skepticism both about like the medical side but also like social transition for minors have come from like sources like the New York Times and like Jesse Singal that are generally considered like more liberal or moderate, and also that specifically like target and appeal to like upper class, like urban and suburban, like white, like liberal Democrats. So yeah, I guess, and also a lot of these like articles, including like that New York Times article, like the battle over gender therapy, have actually been used to like legitimize some of the anti-trans bills. So I guess what I was wondering is sort of like, yeah, how do you all think like that side of things has like shaped the public discourse and like contributed like with more like people who are considered more liberal, like to like turn them against like trans people and specifically trans kids, and like how can we try to combat that and like stop that sort of like wave of like opinion influence from shaping the debate?
I had maybe two thoughts, but my first one was kind of taking one step back and thinking about what you're talking about in terms of this questioning of what is kind of considered the standard science. Like what has medical science as well as social science taught us about how you best treat like trans youth and all these things. And you have these articles that come out, New York Times being maybe a major publication, but that was something I was going to talk about when you said, who are these other people? There are now academics and social scientists and medical scientists who have a different point of view, who are getting research published in peer-reviewed journals that are scientifically faulty. But now those of us who are doing social science are having to stop our own research agendas to write our own rebuttals to those studies. But I'm sure all of you have heard of the term rapid onset gender dysphoria, which was a term coined by an article that was published that wasn't even a survey or study of youth. It was of like parents' comments on like online postings. So yes, I see your concern about how that trickles into the mass media, but I'm thinking about what is happening to the research base and how is that changing, gets percolating up into the changing discourse. And then to tie on to that, I suspect that part of this is because during the time of marriage equality, when it became like, what does the social science research say about same-sex couples and same-sex couples raising children? How many of them are raising children? And that actually became a big driver in the California case. And so there was a learning that you need to have kind of science and data on your side, or at least enough science and data to put the established science in question.
I mean, I have many thoughts on this, and the so-called experts that were used in the marriage fights are now showing up as our experts in litigation. But I do think that the center-left media has been one of the central drivers of anti-trans legislation. And
Wait, say that again?
I think the center-left media has been one of the central drivers of anti-trans legislation. And I've been saying it for a long time. I thought that the coverage of the first anti-trans bills in the New York Times was one of the sort of legitimizing spaces of legitimizing the debate over transness in a fundamentally sort of politicized way under this rubric of objectivity. And so I think that this idea, and it comes from opinion pages and sort of editorial viewpoints and all sorts of things, but the New York Times, I think, is the largest culprit. But I think largely you sort of have Michelle Goldberg writing a piece called "What is a Woman" in 2014, positioning cis women and trans women against each other. And that then becomes, I've talked about this all the time, but it's actually like almost comical to me how many white cis women have written pieces in the New York Times and the Atlantic and every publication you can imagine that are all called "What is a Woman?" Eleanor Burkett wrote the same article in 2015 in the New York Times when Caitlyn Jenner came out. And there is a way where you read some of these articles and you're like, it definitely could only be written by a white woman who feels so entitled to define the contours of womanhood as such. But there is a way where these conversations have really fueled the legislative and legal fights, I will say, and that for example, in Oklahoma's opposition to our motion to preliminarily enjoin their anti-trans healthcare ban, they cited to the New York Times 27 times many of the so-called medical experts that are put forth in defense of these laws, almost all of them that have been discredited by judges that have been appointed by presidents across the political spectrum, have often cited to articles in the New York Times in support of their position. And so it's really hard to say that that things that are positioned as reporting on what the state of the science is aren't actually constructing our sense of the legitimacy of trans life in this moment. And so how do we disrupt it? I think we continue to have conversations. And I was listening to you and I was like, oh, I'm not suited to many forms of advocacy because I don't affirm people's discomfort. I'm like, nope, that's not what my job is. And so I very much feel that I see it as doing large-scale narrative disruption and cultural change work, and understanding that it's a long game and that it's going to take time.
Thank you.
I know we're short on time.
Hi, I'm Alan. I'm a undergrad, fourth-year undergrad in the college, and I got two questions, but I'll be quick. So the first question is that during my previous research and social work with some transgender individuals in China, I encountered some transgender individuals with strong hostilities against all LGBTQ concepts. They denounced the concept of trans, queer, or gender non-binary, saying that they just want to be normal men and normal women. And so have you encountered similar cases in the US, and how do you understand this or work with this? The second question is that many cultural conservatives in China are very zealous in importing conservative propagandas from the US, from Trump, from Fox News, or from other conservative propagandas, especially those that's anti-LGBTQs, whether they are true or whether they are fake. And we also see this not only in China, but also we see that, for example, Putin's Russia also embraced a lot of Republican rhetoric, and also other right-wing parties like in Germany and Italy and other places in the world. How do we see this conservative unity against these, and how do we, thank you.
You did have a Chinese army colonel who's transgender. There was a major story about 5 years ago, and I believe I'm trying to wrap everything into your question. That's an example of, I think, in China, and I can't speak to everybody you did your research on, that trans people exist in China and they could be accepted and celebrated in China. because we in the United States learned about this Army colonel because of the media that came out on CGTV. It's a Chinese government television. So that tells me that politically, maybe governmentally, that there may be official problems with having transgender people exist in China, and maybe culturally amongst some of the people. But if I'm a transgender person in China, maybe I have a fair chance at a life there. But what's happening around the world, in Russia, parts of the United States, et cetera, this international movement against transgender people, that is something that's very connected. It goes to some parts of fascism, some parts of totalitarianism, some parts of ultra-conservatism. But how to relate that to exactly what's going on in China, that's beyond my pay grade. So I'll turn it over to these two nice gentlemen.
I don't know if you wanted to answer the first question with the recent podcast or the recent coverage that you did in The Atlantic, the interview.
Oh, wait, the first question was about conservatives or the first?
Just this idea
Of transgender, just want to consider as normal men and women, they denounce transgender.
right, not necessarily like tied in with, say, being a part of the LGBT.
I don't know, because I don't know enough about the Chinese context. I will say that sometimes repression and that desire go together. In other words, when there isn't, I don't know, but when there isn't a lot of sort of tolerance or understanding, the safest maybe option is to just want to say I want to be that a normal man or a normal woman. Like in Iran, for example, I remember there was a great documentary about the fact that you could get healthcare coverage for becoming a normal man or a normal woman, but you couldn't be gay. So there's a sense that you're preserving the order of things.
The binary.
Yeah, you're preserving the binary in a way that is comfortable, because it's too scary to not do that. But that's just a guess.
Yeah, I think we see that, and I do think we see that everywhere, and there's lots of reasons for it. This idea that this identity has been so violently taken from me that I just want to get to live it without you defining the terms of it, not you modifying it, not you telling me what communities I'm a part of. Like, I'm a woman, and just like all women. And then on the sort of large, I do think we're like an incredibly large exporter around the world of discriminatory and simplistic rhetoric. I do think a lot of it is also coming from Western Europe. I think we're funding it in the U.S. We're funding a lot of it, and then these are being then exported around the world, and it is really scary. And then I think as people who are voters in the United States, as U.S. citizens, we have a responsibility to sort of track this money and track this process and hold the entities and individuals to account.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi there, I'm James. I'm a first year at Harris, the Public Policy School. My question is about, it's like kind of more logistical in terms of, it seems like a lot of these fights are happening at the state level, right? State legislatures, particularly not really in areas that are going to get a lot of news coverage in sort of national media. And I'm asking this specifically because up until about 6 months ago, I was a public school teacher in New Jersey, and I didn't really even know until you mentioned it that all these debates and issues that are happening there. So my question is really just how do you advise people to pay attention to notice what's going on in their state legislatures and within their sort of local state issues if those aren't getting the reporting in the big papers?
That's actually one of the things we discussed earlier. That's the hardest thing about not having strong local media, because ordinarily you would get reports of what's happening at your city council, at your school board, and so forth. And really, you aren't. And it's making regular citizens have to be overly engaged almost to know what's going on. So quite frankly, I don't have a great solution for it, except for we need people like you, to, particularly if you're coming from an education background, to try to track what's going on in your town or in your county. Because where I live in Mercer County, New Jersey, it started in one town next door to where I live as a city councilwoman. 2 years ago, tried to warn some of the other folks in other towns to watch out for this, and they didn't, because they did the school board. Nobody cares about school board elections. And now we're dealing with removing transgender protections in individual towns. Also with book bans, that's actually happening. They call it decommissioning books, like you're decommissioning a Navy ship. True story. So that's where I have to say it's really going to be up to citizen activists to provide that middle ground. Just the big thing is try to be as fair as possible, because if you are as fair as possible and you're factual, then you'll be believed, which is one of the advantages we have over the bad actors who are trying to force this legislation.
I will also say there's almost always a reliable, like a gay rights organization or some organization that you can bookmark, because they're usually, and the ACLU will do it state by state, like they're usually tracking like minute legislation and school board legislation. So you can just see things rise or fall or whether things are passing. That's what I do, because local media is just, you know.
I'm not willing to fully accept the death of local media also. I think it's like, you know, the beat reporters that used to cover state houses, like, that was such an incredible resource. And I do think that there's a serious problem as we've lost local media. And so trying to sort of thinking about that as a central political movement to sort of bring that back and think about the cost of not having it.
I mean, if all of you want to educate yourself, just pick your state and go watch the debate that your legislature had about some trans bill, whatever the SB1 was in your state. It's unbelievable. I did that. I watched 15 hours of the Texas. You can't believe the kinds of things that people say and what passes for science and medicine. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And it's always some doctor who sponsors the bill, but it's a doctor. So it'll be not anyone who has any expertise in pediatric endocrinology. It will be very far from that, but they'll always pick the doctor. Anyway, it's very infuriating to watch. It would make an amazing article if there was local newspapers to write it, but Anyway, we're really out of time, so let's move quickly through the last few questions.
Hi, I'm Ashlyn Weimer. I'm a fourth year in the college and a first year in the Computational Social Science Master's program. I thought y'all's discussion of the, narrative and the role that narratives and counter narratives play in determining how people are falling on trans rights as an issue is really on the nose, and it got me thinking about the role of social media in that, where it both acts as a force to cause polarization, where people are getting echo chambers, but also there's a lot of queer people on social media, so on some level it's a potential avenue to getting those narratives to people. And I just kind of wanted to hear what y'all's opinion on the role of social media in this is. Is this a rock weighing us down? Is it a potential avenue to change public opinion?
So there's been some work on this, but since X kind of took down all of its abilities for social scientists to do research, that's kind of now a more open question about what is social media doing and how can we actually measure it. I don't think you're incorrect. It's also kind of, what does the algorithm feed you? And it's kind of feeding you what you want to see, right? So I think that's going to be a limit.
What I would say as far as social media goes, measuring it is going to get more and more difficult. You might also have companies who don't want great folks like Andrew to be able to measure these things. But the big thing that you can do for social media, through social media, is if you happen to be transgender, gay, lesbian, non-binary, is tell your story as comfortable as you can, because that shows if you represent yourself, you're also likely to be representing other people. And the biggest problem transgender people particularly have is roughly only about 40% of the country actually knows a transgender person. And Generation Z and Generation Y, it's roughly about 41%. When you get towards Gen X, it's only about 33%. And then when you get to baby boomer, it's around 31%. But that's the representation is the key to changing a lot of this.
Thank you all for being such an engaged audience, and thank you to the panel.